Well folks, this is it, the final Boost Sonic game. And after the standard definition Unleashed more racing-esque design, Unleashed HD's mix of chaotic speed and fast-paced platforming, and Colors' more gimmicky, slow-paced, and exploration-based design, there are plenty of directions Generations could choose to go in. Much like with the Unleashed games, the easiest way for me to get into the overall idea of this game's identity is to simply look at its first main boost stage, Modern Green Hill Zone. We begin with a straightforward path the player can boost down and where they can come to grips with Sonic's controls. Following this, they're flung into a basic platforming challenge where they'll come to understand how Sonic's jump feels in this game. Afterward, there's a line of enemies to either homing attack or boost through. Then the clearly indicated paths begin. One slower that involves platforming and homing attacks, the other faster, but requiring the player to pull off a relatively careful jump into this red ring that will propel them forward. Next, there's a narrow path, which players are meant to boost through, and a big spectacle loop. Here, the game has basically shown the player how the 3D sections of these stages will play out. Boost through straightaways and crowds of enemies, use well-timed jumps to reach faster paths, which will generally be quite easy to see but require skill to get to. It's a fast-paced, effective opening segment, and one that the player will likely be able to go through quicker on subsequent runs using things like the air boost. Following this, the game shifts to a 2D perspective. First, there's this short area with an upper and lower path. The upper one has rings, indicating that it's generally going to be the better one to take if such an option presents itself. Then there's this booster, which will fling Sonic up and around into these bumpers. Here, the player can also create a faster path by memorizing the layout and stopping here. Next up, the perspective shifts to 2.5D, and the player needs to react quickly to squeeze into this gap and keep their forward momentum. Afterward, the pathway branches again. On the lower route, there's a safety net of sorts, followed by a moment where the player can boost for a faster option by flinging themselves up here to these enemies they can homing attack into. Alternatively, if they haven't figured out how the boost works yet or just didn't boost at the right time, there is a spring that'll send them up. The uppermost path, meanwhile, will grind right over this entire section, allowing the player to keep their speed and get a faster time. Following this, there's another path that splits in 3. If the player isn't boosting, they'll likely fall down to the lowest and slowest section. However, if they are boosting, they'll fly straight through this middle area. A well-timed jump, meanwhile, will send them to the highest path, which will allow them to use these red rings to fling themselves forward. Then we get our first big moment of spectacle, with this giant fish leaping above the water while the player grinds on rails. This concludes with it chasing Sonic up before he flings himself into the next section and narrowly escapes. From here, the 2D pathways continue, but with significantly increased complexity. And it's at a point where it's hard to describe each individual path in the stage because there are so many areas here. Really, depending on if you initially take a higher or lower path, it's like an entirely different level. And in a stroke of genius, if you're on the slower path, you can see a lot of the faster one in the background, a point of intrigue for players, and a way to encourage them to try again and see what happens over there. Then if you miss a jump, there's this short, windy platforming section in tight corridors. Of course, jumping will allow you to bypass this. Finally, the player will return to the faster path they would have been on if they had taken the higher path in the first place. This is exactly what I want a slower path in a Sonic game to look like. Instead of simply being more tedious or repetitive, it has ample opportunities to use your skill to still go faster by clearing obstacles with proper timing, even if you'll never be able to quite reach the blistering speed of the faster path. Basically, when I end up here, I'm not annoyed. I'm only curious about what else this level has in store for me, and absolutely floored by the fact that this much of its material is entirely optional. It makes the stage feel alive and interesting without it becoming overly complex or convoluted. Let's go to the faster path now, which you'll only reach with a couple carefully timed jumps. Continuing on the grind rail path, the player will experience this short cinematic moment, then they'll need to crouch again to move forward. Alternatively though, they can wall jump to bypass that bit of spectacle and move forward slightly faster. Afterward, if the player doesn't boost, they'll drop into this area, from which they'll need to climb back up. Otherwise, they can boost straight over it all and go through a wild-looking corkscrew path that harkens back to classic games. From here, the stage seems like a straightforward boost fest to the finish, though that isn't quite the case, since there is a hidden path where the player can stomp through this bridge to get to the finish faster. So, even in this introductory stage, there are still little secrets to uncover. To say the stage is brilliant is somehow an understatement. Even though it can easily be completed in under 2 minutes, there's an incredible amount of depth to be found here with how perfectly it introduces the player to modern Sonic's style of gameplay, the way it lays out its intertwining paths, and the wonderful sense of speed and spectacle it manages to achieve. And I don't think I've focused on that last point enough actually, because this stage is beautiful. The backgrounds have so many layers. The player runs over bridges and grass and through tunnels, grinds on rails over water, and It just feels like they got about as much as they could out of this aesthetic, to the point that no future game really needs to come back here. Basically, this is it. This is the platonic ideal of Green Hill Zone. The only potential issue I could see someone having with it is that it doesn't have that much in the way of 3D gameplay, instead opting to focus more on 2D sections. And yeah, that could be a problem, but it's not a problem for me. I absolutely adore this stage. Fortunately though, this game does have more in-depth 3D gameplay as well. First off, there's the opening of Modern Chemical Plant, which has 3 paths. The first one, a straightforward shot to the main path. The right one, meanwhile, allows the player to get this extra life, and then there's the left path, which the player can take to help them skip over a big chunk of the level by flying off into the distance and using the lightspeed dash to move onward, bypassing this whole grind rail area that the main path leads to. A path that itself has 2 options. The first one being the grind rails I've already discussed that deposits the player on a slightly longer lower path. The second one, meanwhile, requiring that the player carefully turns onto the leftmost booster, which will propel them into this sort of crane and onto a higher path with a red ring. When you say it all out loud, it sounds like a lot, but it's amazing how easy it is to understand all of this stuff when you're actually playing. Similarly, we have the beginning of Speed Highway. Here, the player can either choose to go through this massive loop-de-loop by simply holding boost. If they keep on the slowest path, then they will go along a wall, dodging bombs by sidestepping before quickly moving into a tight turn. Alternatively, at the beginning, the player can jump up to get on this grind rail. If they miss that jump, they'll just end up back on the lower path. But if they act fast enough, they get to continue on another grind rail, boost along a different wall, and speed past this longer turn the lower path would have forced them into. Finally, there's the helicopter, which can be accessed with a careful jump and will deposit the player directly onto this grind rail in the fastest path. This is just an absolutely outstanding mix of spectacle and speed, providing ample room for player choice in an impressively dense space. Later, after this police chase down a massive building, the player can either take this straight path, which will lead them down a longer route, or if they notice this secret path tucked to the right, they can bypass a good deal of the 2D stuff and continue on their way. Afterward, going further down the regular path will lead to a bit more 3D platforming, followed by a moment where a careful jump can basically propel you to the finish. Otherwise, it's the long way around. But earlier on, there was this higher road, which yes, you can reach that by hitting this somewhat hidden boost ramp. This will then take you through the darker part of the city, crossing over a rooftop before ending off with a straight shot to the finish. Sky Sanctuary has a similarly well-done multi-threaded 3D design. It begins by introducing these cloud platforms in a safe area, then quickly branches into an upper path with more precision platforming and a lower path that's, you guessed it, slower. However, it still offers options, where the player can either get back to the top using these clouds to bounce or run over to this bumper and go up. From here, the stage splits into a left and right path. On the left, there are these rainbow rings to propel you forward past some platforming, or alternatively, you can explore down here for a 1-up. Afterward, it takes the player to a 2D section that's short-lived, but serves to change the pace a bit. Though you can actually get around this too by going to the right path, which, if you manage to stay at the top, can lead the player straight through this window and into a 3D section. Speed Highway actually has a similar section where you can entirely avoid a big 2D section with a tricky jump. Either way though, Sky Sanctuary's 3D sections keep coming back to this style of design, with clearly denoted branching pathways. It's a lot like Modern Green Hill, but where that stage was more 2D focused, this one feels the opposite. This type of level design has simply been translated into 3D with a startling degree of success. Rooftop Run's first section is similar too, though it's not quite as easy to read. Now, that's not necessarily a complaint. I actually like the variety it provides with just how dense it is and how naturalistic the environments look by comparison. Sure, it can make it a little harder to make out each and every path, but they're still reasonable to find, and as expected by now, it has some solid 3D platforming, and it's just deeply satisfying to find the fastest path. Out of all the stages though, Crisis City probably features the most 3D platforming. Now, this one isn't quite as complex or dense as Sky Sanctuary and is a lot more straightforward, with paths that quickly bottleneck into shared areas, but there are plenty of small opportunities to save time and tighten up a run. It also helps that this stage has one of the best remixes of a prior game's ideas, with running toward a tornado in a sidestepping section with cars flying toward you, instead of running away from one as it was in the original game. Planet Wisp's opening is in a similar vein too, with short-lived but still interesting branching paths, and it does a wonderful job of mimicking these opening moments in Planet Wisp in Sonic Colors, without feeling like a straight one-to-one recreation or something like that. City Escape, meanwhile, is quite different from the rest. While it has a couple brief, more open 3D segments, most of its 3D is reserved for more spectacle-focused gameplay. This starts with snowboarding down the street, which, I mean, how couldn't you have that in a City Escape recreation? But just because it's spectacle doesn't mean there's no choice. There are plenty of little moments to jump into rings or off ramps to bypass sections. On the other hand though, the end of this stage is probably the game's largest set piece in my mind, where this iconic truck chases you from behind, but then it starts flying. It's awesome, and the first time I saw it, I laughed out loud at how ridiculous it was. Unfortunately though, I've got to admit that on subsequent playthroughs, the length of this section makes it one of my least favorite to tighten up times on. There just isn't enough player choice in this area, but it's still a solid moment. Then finally, we have Seaside Hill. This is easily my favorite stage in Sonic Generations and the peak of its 3D design as far as I'm concerned. Similar to Chemical Plant's opening, the stage splits into 3 paths. The middle one will take you over this ramp and around an iconic loop and into a 2D section that sends you weaving left and right up this tight space. So a pretty short, basic 3D section. The left path, meanwhile, sends the player over a slightly higher area where they'll go over a loop and into a bumper, which sends them to the 2D section, though starting a little higher up than in the middle route. And then we have the right side. At first when I went here, I was a bit confused. I went down the sandy beach and over the water, and then I was just back up where the middle path would have put me. If anything, this seemed longer than the middle path. But then I saw it, a row of rings on the water a little further away. So I boosted toward them and I began to run on top of the water, and I went underneath the loop into this cannon that's tucked away here. Using this, you can bypass pretty much the whole first 2D section. I've played this stage so much and I still had no idea you could cut straight through like this. Discovering the secret was incredibly satisfying and I was just grinning like an idiot. It honestly brought me right back to finding that hidden life box in Speed Highway and Sonic Adventure. You know the one, I'm gonna show it here. It was just this magical moment of understanding how many angles the designers thought of this stage from, and it was like I'd cracked the code. Fortunately, the stage keeps up the amazing design too. Using these rainbow rings, you can go on this upper path, performing some careful homing attacks to get to this area. Here, boosting will get you to the higher path, which has its own set of platforming challenges, or if you don't boost, you'll end up down here and have to make your way to the side cannon that will send you back to the lower path. Meanwhile, if you drop down from this point, then you're on the beach and you have to get to this lower cannon, which will just waste more time. And yeah, they nailed a more open, discovery-focused style of 3D design using the boost formula. I mean, I haven't even discussed the lower path here where you'll run along the beach in the first place, but oh yeah, you're running on water. So you can actually take another faster path by thinking outside the box. Later, the same thing comes up in this area where you can either take a race car or go through this incredibly windy 3D area with so many paths, and I just kept replaying and replaying this level and discovering new things. Again, this stage is just magical, and as far as I'm concerned, it's basically peak 3D Sonic gameplay. However, none of this is to discredit the general 2D design as well, which I already praised in Green Hill, because yes, this style keeps coming back, making up for about 35% of my total playtime in these modern stages, and it's mostly great. A lot of it is pretty short-lived, or even the sort of thing you can entirely skip on a faster run, but it consistently leans into that branching Sonic design without ever getting too confusing. Much like most of the game's other gimmicks or different styles of play, they also don't tend to overstay their welcome and instead serve as a satisfying change of pace. In particular, I adore the 2D sections in Chemical Plant. Here, if you know what you're doing, maintain the higher path, and move fast enough to avoid the rising liquid, you never need to enter the chemical crap. But unfortunately, I've got to stop the endless praise, because there are a couple stages with sections I'm not as fond of. First off, Crisis City's 2D areas are just fine. As usual, finding the faster route can be pretty fun, but the overuse of the stomp move makes the section a bit bland and repetitive, though it's far from a major issue. However, then we have Planet Wisp. Overall, I can confidently say I love every stage in Generations, except this one. Though the stage starts with 3D, the vast majority of it is in 2D, and is spent climbing up a spire of sorts, a type of design that was fairly common in Colors. Similarly to how Colors did things on occasion, it's a more confusing type of stage, which requires a bit more exploration because it's way easier to get lost. Again, considering Colors' focus on exploration, I can see what they were going for. But unfortunately, I don't think this quite worked out here. For one, the Rocket Wisp is back, and much like in Colors itself, I find that it brings the pace of the stage to a screeching halt. Then there are these sort of baskets you have to hop on, and yeah, way too much of this level feels scripted, and despite it being easy to get lost, it hardly feels open. It's far from the worst stage I've ever played. I hesitate to even call it outright bad, but it sticks out like a sore thumb among the rest of these brilliantly designed areas. However, it's hard to get all that upset about that. I love 8 out of 9 of these stages, and I go back and replay them all the time. These levels are a big part of why this is my favorite Sonic game, and again, it just feels like the boost formula has been near perfected. There really isn't anywhere to go from here. So it's probably a good thing that Sonic decided to change its design style after this, and no. No, 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 no!